Chapter 14, Section 2, Human Genetic Disorders. So in the last section, we talked a little bit about a couple of human genetic disorders that were sex-linked, or rather on the X chromosome. In this section, we're going to talk about a couple of dominant disorders and a couple of recessive disorders. Many of these are also the ones that you guys did your projects on. So have you ever heard the expression that it runs in the family? Well, relatives or friends might have said that about your smile, the shape of your ears, maybe the shape of your head. But what does that mean when we talk about diseases and disorders? Well, we're talking about inherited diseases now. So small changes in DNA molecules affect human traits. We know this. And we know that it directly or rather indirectly affects a person's phenotype. Now, when we talk about phenotype, don't forget that some of your characteristics are maybe diseases that you have. And obviously, there's a direct link between genotype and phenotype. An example is earwax. People of African and European ancestry are more likely to have earwax that is wet, whereas Asians or Native Americans have earwax that could be dry. The wet earwax is to the dry type of earwax. And what causes this is a simple DNA change where instead of having guanine, we have adenine in the gene. And this causes the protein to produce dry earwax instead of wet earwax. Now, one genetic disease that you guys may or may not know about is sickle cell anemia or sickle cell disease. And what this is caused by is defective allele in hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is the protein that carries oxygen. And what happens to people who have this? Well, what it is that their red blood cells have a distinct sickle shape, okay? And also these sickle-shaped cells are a little bit stiffer or more rigid than normal ones, and they get stuck in the capillaries. And when they get stuck in the capillaries, that's when there's problems. So this can cause damage to cells, tissues, and even the organs. Now, sickle cell is most common in people of African, Mediterranean, and South American descent. Cystic fibrosis. Now, this is most common among people of European ancestry. And this is caused by the deletion of 3 bases. And I believe it's on chromosome number 7. It's deletion of just 3 bases in the gene for a protein called cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator. So you don't have to remember that, but you should know that the amino acid phenylalanine is missing from the protein. So you should know that it's common among Europeans and that it causes one of the amino acids to be missing from the protein. And because it's missing from the protein, the chloride ions don't pass across the cell membranes. All right? The loss of the bases removes a single amino acid, and it causes the protein not to fold improperly. And because the protein doesn't fold correctly, the cell membrane is unable to allow or to transport chloride ions across the membrane. So if they can't go across the membrane, then the tissues throughout the body malfunction. Because you have to understand the chloride is important for you clearing the mucus from your lungs. So some symptoms are people that have cystic fibrosis, they can have digestive problems. And a big one is that they have heavy mucus that clogs their lungs and breathing passageways. So cystic fibrosis, a person can be homozygous or heterozygous for it. And if they have the normal copy of that CF allele, they're unaffected. Okay? And if they have 2 of the abnormal ones, then they would have the disease. So that tells you right there that what? CF is a recessive disease. Okay? In Huntington's disease, this is another one that someone will do a project on. It's caused by a dominant allele that's found in brain cells. It's on chromosome number 4. And here we have a different type of mutation. Do you remember where we had repeats or duplication? I think we called it duplication. Well, what ends up happening is there are a long string of bases in which the codon CAG is repeated, and it's repeated over and over again. And the greater number of repeats determines when the disease will appear. So normally the repeat should be from 10 to 26. If it's 27 to 41, kind of what's called pre-mutation. And then 36 to 121 repeats, that's when you start having the symptoms. Okay. Symptoms of Huntington's include mental deterioration, uncontrolled movements. Now, these symptoms usually don't appear until middle age, so maybe 40s or 50s, so you wouldn't know that you had this disease until then. They do have a test to know if you have the gene for this, because like I said, it is a dominant disease. And if it's dominant, that means all you need is one allele to have this in order to have the Huntington's disease. So disorders such as sickle cell and CF are still common in human populations. 1 in 12 people of African ancestry have it, and 1 in 25 of European people have, European ancestry have the cystic fibrosis one. So even though these diseases can be fatal, why are they still around? Well, have enough people died from it or not? Well, it's funny because sometimes with genetic diseases come genetic advantages. For instance, the people who have sickle cell are immune or have a resistance to a disease called malaria. Malaria is passed through mosquitoes. When mosquitoes bite you, they can infect the person with a parasite, and the parasite is what is malaria. And that parasite lives inside red blood cells. So people who are heterozygous for sickle cell are resistant to malaria. And so if you've got people who are dying, people who are homozygous for sickle cell are dying from sickle cell, and then you have people who are resistant to malaria who are heterozygous, that keeps the allele in the population. Okay? Same thing with cystic fibrosis. There used to be an epidemic of typhoid fever years ago. They still have typhoid in some places. And typhoid is usually in water that's not purified or water that's not clean. And it enters the body, when people drink this water. Well, the protein that's produced by the cystic fibrosis blocks this bacterium. So people who were heterozygous for cystic fibrosis have an advantage over those who were not heterozygous for it. Okay? And here's a couple of charts of some well-known human diseases, and you are expected to know the name of the disorder and whether or not it's dominant or recessive, and what the symptoms are of it. So achondroplasia, that's a dominant disorder, and it's one form of dwarfism. Huntington's disease, we already talked about. I'm not going to ask you about hypercholesterolemia. Okay. Now, sickle cell is a codominant disorder, and you get damage to your tissues, and you have sickled cells, sickled red blood cells. Some caused by recessive alleles or albinism. You guys have heard of albinos, and that's the lack of pigment in the skin. Cystic fibrosis, you know what that does. Galactosemia is an accumulation of galactose that's in milk. And what is people can't digest galactose. Phenylketonuria is another one, and that's one of the ones I want to make sure that you know. And this can be controlled with diet. And then Tay-Sachs disease, which is common among Jewish people. And in fact, they're called Ashkenazi Jews. And one of the telltale signs of it is a red dot in the back of the eye. So that's kind of different. So non-disjunction, just another review in non-disjunction. So non-disjunction is an error in meiosis when the chromosomes fail to separate correctly. And the result of non-disjunction would be an abnormal number of chromosomes. Okay? And the disorder is of chromosome numbers. So normally it's either going to be what? Trisomy or monosomy. Trisomy when there's an extra one, so the individual would have 47 chromosomes, or monosomy where the individual has 45 chromosomes. Now understand, it's a abnormal number of chromosomes in the gametes. And when those gametes, that particular sperm or that particular egg is fertilized, it turns into a zygote, that's when it causes problems. So if 2 copies of a chromosome fail to separate, the child can be born with 3 copies of that chromosome, and that's trisomy. One of the most common forms of trisomy is Down syndrome, and it's trisomy of the 21st chromosome. Another type of chromosomal disorder is Turner syndrome. I talked about this in class, and that's when you just have one X. Okay? So this would be monosomy rather with the one X. Usually women with the Turner syndrome are sterile because their sex organs don't develop properly at puberty. The girl on the left is one with Turner syndrome. Boys can have non-disjunction, and that can cause what's called Klinefelter syndrome, and that results from the inheritance of an extra X. So now we've got trisomy of the X chromosome, okay, and it interferes with them reproducing. So here's a little, some information on XXY. Okay, go ahead and read that. And know that you cannot live without an X. I've talked about this in class before because there's too many genes on the X chromosome that are vital for survival and development.